Well, many Albertans have been lining up for the past year to sign a petition either to stay in Canada or support independence. The group behind Alberta's separatist movement is now doing a feasibility study on how an independent Alberta would be able to fund itself. To talk more about the economics of separation, we welcome Moshe Lander, who is an economics professor living here in Alberta. Thanks so much for joining us for this conversation. First of all, what are the costs of being an independent nation, potentially that people aren't really talking about or thinking about right now?
You have to build an entire nation then. You need border control, which means that you're going to need to have some sort of army. You're going to have your provincial police force. You're going to have a passport. You're going to have a central bank. You're going to need to have a diplomatic corps. And so for a government that's looking to constantly try and slim down the provincial civil service, you're in fact going to expand it massively because you're going to have to duplicate everything that goes on in hated Ottawa now in Edmonton. And then all of a sudden, you have to worry about all of the taxation components that are going to be necessary for Alberta citizens to be able to fund their independent life.
It sounds expensive. It sounds complicated. It sounds like a big, heavy lift. Now, we rely a lot on investment in this province. What would that situation be like if we were our own independent nation?
It would plunge. Alberta becomes a landlocked country the moment that it separates. And for everybody who thinks that the U.S. is going to be there to support Alberta, like we've seen some of the people within the separatist group talking, the issue, of course, is that the Americans don't want Alberta. They want Alberta oil, and they already have access to that through the pipelines that exist into the U.S. But the idea of Alberta being part of the U.S. is a complete non-starter, and the separatist groups themselves have identified they don't want that themselves. So what exactly then is going to happen when you're a landlocked country? How are you going to be able to get all of your products out? You're going to have to cross Canada. And at that point, then Canada can impose tariffs. The U.S. can impose tariffs. And for the separatist group that says, well, we're going to impose tariffs on goods that try to cross through an independent Alberta, guess what? People will find their way around it because they're not going to want to deal with Alberta. And Alberta is not going to have nearly as much leverage as they believe they will when they separate out.
Now, as complicated as this all seems, it's not new. Quebec has gone through its own separation vote, very famously, very close. What kind of consequences there from that vote should people be paying attention to now here in Alberta?
So while I live in Alberta, I do teach in Quebec, and it's very clear that businesses raced out of here in the 1990s during that referendum and in the aftermath. The most telling one is that the Bank of Montreal, with a long history of being in Quebec, is actually headquartered in Toronto. And they left as a result of the referendum, where they said, we don't need this uncertainty in our lives. Businesses don't like uncertainty, and we've seen that in the last 12 months with all of the menacing coming from the U.S. with terror talk and trade disruption. The last thing that they want is additional self-inflicted uncertainty, and so they raced away and never came back. The reality is that people would leave as well, as they have in Quebec, because they don't necessarily want to be part of an independent country. And there was talk at the time that if Quebec can separate, can Montreal separate from Quebec? You could very easily imagine that there's pockets within Alberta that are going to say, we don't want to be a part of an independent Alberta, or whatever the premier is using as her word salad. And so they might decide that they want to vote themselves to remain in Canada. You could have a complete disaster on your hand. And that's when businesses say, you know what, I think I'm just going to move to Kelowna or Saskatoon or Regina. And if I'm the mayors of those cities, I'm jumping up and down on the table right now saying, come over here because we have no plans of leaving Canada.
Now, really quickly before you go, what about equalization? A lot of people think that we get a raw deal economically with Ottawa. What do you say to that?
The average amount paid is under $600 per person in Alberta. So we're prepared to rip up the country and go our own way over $600. I get cost of living is a major issue for people right now, but $600 over 52 weeks works out to about $12 a week. I don't think that's enough to try and tear apart a country over.
Okay, well, there's certainly a lot to think about economically as this conversation continues. Moshe Lander, thank you so much for your time this morning. We appreciate you joining us.
Anytime.